Sarah Chen stood in the empty hospital billing office at 11:47 p.m., holding an insurance check worth $47,000, enough money to keep her dying husband alive for another month. 8 months ago, she was just another invisible janitor mopping floors for $14.50 an hour. Tonight, she was the most successful thief in the hospital's history, having stolen nearly $3 million without anyone noticing. Her husband's stage 4 pancreatic cancer was in remission because Sarah had learned to forge signatures, create fake identities, and rob the very institution that employed her. But in less than 4 hours, Washington State Patrol would pull her over 47 miles from home, ending the most desperate love story ever told. The woman who became a master criminal to save her husband's life was about to discover that some victories cost everything. On the morning of March 14, 2018, Sarah Chen arrived at Riverside Regional Medical Center in Spokane, Washington at exactly 6:47 a.m., just as she had every weekday for the past 11 years. The parking lot was nearly empty except for the overnight staff's vehicles and a few early arriving doctors. Sarah pulled her 10-year-old Honda Civic into the same spot she always chose, row 3, space 14, and sat for a moment, staring at the imposing brick facade of the hospital that had become her second home. At 42, Sarah moved through the hospital corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone whose job was to clean up after others. Her uniform, navy blue scrubs with Riverside Regional embroidered in white thread, marked her as part of the infrastructure, as essential and unnoticed as the heating system or fluorescent lights. Patients, doctors, and nurses barely registered her presence as she pushed her gray plastic cart from room to room, emptying trash bins, mopping floors, and wiping down surfaces that other people had touched, breathed on, bled on. Sarah had perfected the art of being unseen. She knew which hallways were empty at specific times, which offices were left unlocked during lunch breaks, which administrators stayed late and which ones left promptly at 5. She could navigate the hospital's maze-like layout blindfolded, accessing areas that most employees never saw: the basement storage rooms, the executive offices on the 6th floor, the accounting department that handled millions of dollars in insurance payments. What none of them knew was that Sarah Chen had been systematically stealing from the hospital for 8 months. By the time anyone noticed, she would walk away with $2.80 million, the largest embezzlement case in Spokane County history. Sarah's story began not with greed, but with desperation that crept into her life like a slow-growing cancer. In July 2017, her husband David received a diagnosis that shattered their carefully constructed middle-class life: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist, Dr. Patricia Mills, delivered the news in a sterile examination room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The prognosis was grim: 6 to 12 months without treatment, maybe 18 if they pursued aggressive chemotherapy and radiation, not covered by their basic insurance plan. The Chens had always played by the rules, followed the American dream script that promised security in exchange for hard work and modest ambitions. David worked as an auto mechanic at Johnson's Garage on Division Street, where he had been employed for 16 years. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, his back ached from leaning over engines, but he took pride in fixing things that were broken. Sarah earned $14.50 an hour cleaning hospital rooms. A job she had taken after their second miscarriage convinced her that bringing new life into the world wasn't part of their destiny. They owned a modest 2-bedroom home in the Hilliard neighborhood, a working-class area where houses were small but well-maintained, where neighbors knew each other's names and borrowed tools over chain-link fences. They drove a 2009 Honda Civic with 127,000 miles on it, shopped at Walmart and Costco, and had managed to save $23,000 over 15 years of marriage. Not enough for retirement, but sufficient to handle minor emergencies. It wasn't much, but it felt secure. It felt like enough. Cancer destroyed that security overnight with the ruthless efficiency of a natural disaster. By September 2017, their savings were gone, consumed by medical bills that arrived daily like a paper avalanche. David's treatment at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance cost $8,000 per month out of pocket, not including the additional expenses for medications, blood tests, and specialist consultations. Sarah had taken out 3 credit cards: Chase, Capital One, and a store card from Nordstrom that she never intended to use, and maxed them all within 6 weeks. She borrowed $15,000 against their house, signing papers she barely read while David waited in the car, too weak from chemotherapy to come inside. Still, it wasn't enough. The bills kept coming with mechanical precision: $2,400 for chemotherapy drugs that David injected into his port every Tuesday, $1,800 for radiation sessions that left him burned and exhausted, $950 for anti-nausea medication that barely helped him. Keep down water. Sarah created a spreadsheet to track their debt, watching the numbers grow beyond anything she had ever imagined. $60,000, $80,000, $112,000 by October, with no end in sight. "We can't afford this," David whispered one evening in late October, his voice hoarse from treatment. They sat at their kitchen table, the same oak table they had bought at a garage sale when they were newlyweds, surrounded by medical bills that totaled more than they made in 2 years. David's weight had dropped from 180 pounds to 142, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone fighting a battle he might not win. Sarah looked at her husband, this man who had never missed a day of work in 20 years, who built her a garden shed with his own hands during their 3rd year of marriage, who still opened car doors for her and brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, and made a decision that would destroy everything they had built together. That night, after David fell asleep with the help of prescription painkillers, Sarah sat alone in their living room and considered their options. Bankruptcy would destroy David's credit and cost him his job. Johnson's Garage had strict policies about employees with financial problems. Borrowing from family wasn't possible. Both sets of parents were retired and living on fixed incomes. Medical financing companies offered loans at 28% interest, which would only accelerate their financial destruction. Sarah had always been the practical one in their marriage, the planner who balanced checkbooks and researched insurance policies. Now, for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely powerless. Every door seemed closed. Every solution carried consequences they couldn't bear, except one. On October 17, 2017, Sarah Chen committed her first theft. It happened almost by accident, the way most life-changing moments do. Not with dramatic fanfare, but with a simple choice made in an empty hallway during the quiet hours of the evening shift. While cleaning the administrative offices on the 3rd floor, Sarah noticed an envelope on the billing manager's desk marked "Patient Overpayments, Cash Refunds." The envelope was thick, unsealed, and sitting next to a stack of files that wouldn't be reviewed until the following morning. Inside were 12 checks totaling $8,400, waiting to be mailed to patients who had overpaid their bills, routine refunds that happened dozens of times each month as insurance companies adjusted their reimbursements. Sarah stared at the envelope for nearly 5 minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs. The office was empty. The billing manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, always left at exactly 4:30 p.m. to pick up her daughter from daycare. The hallway was quiet except for the distant hum of machines and the occasional page over the intercom system. Sarah's cleaning cart sat in the doorway, evidence of her legitimate reason for being there. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and examined the checks. Made out to different patients, amounts ranging from $127 to $942, all signed by the hospital's comptroller, with the distinctive blue ink he used for all financial documents. Sarah had seen thousands of these checks during her years of cleaning administrative offices. She knew they were rarely missed if they went astray. Patients assumed their refunds were delayed by bureaucracy. Insurance companies assumed the hospital was handling the paperwork, and the hospital staff assumed the checks were in the mail. Sarah slipped 4 checks into her cleaning apron, totaling $2,200. She told herself it was a loan. She would pay it back when David got better, when their insurance finally covered more of his treatment, when their lives returned to something resembling normal. She was borrowing, not stealing. She was surviving, not committing a crime. The checks were made out to different patients, but Sarah had cleaned these offices long enough to know the system. She understood which forms were filed where, which employees had access to what information, and most importantly, how long it typically took for anyone to notice when something went missing. Patient refund checks had a low priority. They weren't emergency payments. They weren't part of the hospital's daily operations, and they certainly weren't monitored with the attention given to payroll or equipment purchases. That evening, Sarah drove to 3 different check cashing stores across Spokane, forging signatures she had practiced from patient files she'd seen discarded in trash cans during her cleaning rounds. The first signature belonged to Maria Santos, a 45-year-old woman who had undergone gallbladder surgery and received a $387 refund. Sarah had practiced Maria's signature 12 times on scrap paper, studying the loops and slants until she could reproduce it naturally. The store clerk, a bored-looking teenager with multiple piercings, barely glanced at the check or the fake identification Sarah had purchased online for $200. The second check belonged to Robert Kim, who had overpaid for his daughter's emergency appendectomy. Sarah had studied his signature from a consent form she found in a medical waste bin, practicing the sharp angles and compressed letters that suggested someone who wrote quickly and impatiently. The clerk at the second store was more attentive, asking Sarah to provide a thumbprint and answer questions about her address, but the fake ID held up under scrutiny. The third check, made out to Jennifer Walsh for $942, was the largest refund in the envelope. Sarah had practiced this signature the longest, noting the elaborate cursive letters that suggested someone who had learned penmanship in an earlier era. The store clerk at the third location, a woman in her 50s who seemed more experienced, looked carefully at both the check and the identification, but ultimately processed the transaction without comment. By 9:30 p.m., Sarah had $2,200 in cash, enough to pay for David's medications for the next 2 weeks. She sat in her car outside the third check cashing store, staring at the money in her hands and feeling a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Power, perhaps, or possibility. For the first time in months, she wasn't helpless. The money bought David's medication for 2 weeks, but cancer didn't pause for moral consideration. When the funds ran out, David's oncologist called to inform them that his next round of chemotherapy would be delayed unless they could provide payment in advance. Sarah looked at her husband, already weak from missing doses of his anti-nausea medication, and stole again. Her method evolved quickly, shaped by necessity and an intelligence she had never been forced to use in her previous life of cleaning hospital rooms and managing a modest household budget. Sarah realized that her position as a custodian gave her unprecedented access to every corner of the hospital, including offices where sensitive financial information was carelessly left unattended. Billing statements with patient account numbers, insurance reimbursement checks awaiting deposit, petty cash funds for various departments. Sarah began to see opportunity everywhere, hidden in plain sight like treasure scattered across a battlefield. The hospital's financial ecosystem was more complex than most people realized. Insurance companies sent reimbursement checks for everything from routine blood tests to complex surgical procedures. These checks, often worth thousands of dollars, moved through a bureaucratic system that prioritized efficiency over security. Payments were logged into computer systems, but the actual physical checks often sat in desk drawers, filing cabinets, or mail slots for days before being processed. In November 2017, Sarah discovered that the hospital's accounting department received insurance reimbursement checks that often sat in desk drawers for days before being deposited. These checks, sometimes worth $30,000 or more, represented payments for surgeries, extended stays, and expensive procedures performed weeks or months earlier. The accounting staff, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork, had developed a casual attitude toward security that would have shocked the hospital's administrators if they had been paying attention. Sarah's plan became more sophisticated as she studied the hospital's financial operations with the focused attention of someone whose husband's life depended on her success. She would accidentally empty trash cans onto accounting desks during her evening shift, creating enough chaos to palm checks while apologizing profusely and cleaning up the mess. The accounting staff, already gone for the day, never witnessed these carefully orchestrated accidents. The next morning, she would call in sick, a privilege she had rarely used during her 11 years of employment, and drive to banks in nearby cities where she had begun opening accounts using fake identification documents purchased online. Coeur d'Alene, 30 minutes across the Idaho border. Pullman, home to Washington State University, where student populations provided cover for her activities. Even as far as Missoula, Montana, a 2-hour drive that she made monthly to establish and maintain her growing network of fraudulent accounts. The fake IDs cost her $800 each, purchased from a website that specialized in what they euphemistically called novelty identification documents. Sarah had researched the process with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else, reading online forums and studying samples until she understood the quality differences between amateur forgeries and professional work. The documents she purchased included driver's licenses, social security cards, and even utility bills that established residential addresses for her fictional identities. Margaret Thompson had an account at Washington Trust Bank in Coeur d'Alene, where she had established herself as a freelance graphic designer working with clients across the Pacific Northwest. Linda Rodriguez banked at Sterling Savings in Pullman, claiming to be a graduate student at Washington State University, conducting research funded by federal grants. Jennifer Walsh used Columbia Banking in Missoula, presenting herself as a consultant for healthcare organizations who traveled frequently for work. Sarah created an entire network of fictional identities, each with checking accounts, debit cards, and carefully constructed backstories that would hold up under casual scrutiny. She memorized details about each identity, their supposed birthdays, addresses, employment histories, and personal preferences, until she could slip into any one of them as easily as changing clothes. By December 2017, Sarah was stealing between $40,000 and $60,000 per month, amounts that would have seemed impossible during her previous life as a hospital custodian, earning less than $30,000 per year. David's condition had stabilized. The expensive treatments were working, his tumors shrinking, his energy returning, but Sarah couldn't stop. The thrill of getting away with it had become intoxicating, a drug more powerful than any medication David was taking. More importantly, she was terrified of what would happen when the money ran out again. The hospital's financial controls were shockingly lax, a consequence of prioritizing patient care over administrative security. Insurance checks were logged into a computer system when they arrived, but if a check went missing between receipt and deposit, it was usually assumed to be a clerical error or postal delay. The sheer volume of transactions, thousands of payments flowing through the system each month, created perfect cover for Sarah's activities. Insurance companies rarely followed up on individual payments unless specifically contacted by hospitals. They assumed their checks had been received and deposited according to normal procedures. Patients had no way of tracking whether their insurance providers had sent payments to hospitals, and hospitals had no incentive to report missing payments to insurance companies until months later, when year-end reconciliations revealed discrepancies. Sarah developed routines that minimized risk while maximizing her take. Never steal from the same department twice in 1 week. Always vary the amounts, sometimes $15,000, sometimes $50,000. Never a round number that might trigger attention from bank employees trained to watch for suspicious patterns. Never deposit more than $9,000 at once to avoid federal reporting requirements that would create permanent records of her transactions. Always dress professionally when visiting banks. Never in her hospital uniform. Always carrying props like business cards or work documents that supported her cover stories. She kept meticulous records in a notebook hidden in her bedroom dresser, tracking every stolen check, every bank deposit, every expense related to David's treatment. The notebook, bound in black leather and originally intended for grocery lists and household budgets, became a detailed ledger of financial crimes that would eventually serve as evidence in her prosecution. By March 2018, Sarah had stolen $2,847,000 from Riverside Regional Medical Center. David's cancer was in remission, his doctors cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. They had paid off their house, purchased a new Toyota Camry, and Sarah had secretly deposited $400,000 in a Cayman Islands account she planned to use for their retirement. She had also established a safety net of cash hidden throughout their home, $40,000 in the basement, $15,000 in the attic, $8,000 taped underneath their bedroom dresser. She told herself she was Robin Hood, stealing from a wealthy hospital to save her husband's life. Riverside Regional Medical Center had annual revenues exceeding $200 million, executive salaries in the high six figures, and enough financial resources to absorb her theft without affecting patient care. But late at night, when David slept peacefully beside her, his breathing steady and unlabored for the first time in months, Sarah knew the truth. She was addicted to the power, the rush, the knowledge that she, invisible Sarah Chen, who had spent 11 years cleaning other people's messes, had outsmarted everyone. The beginning of the end came on March 26, 2018, when Riverside Regional hired a new chief financial officer, Margaret Walsh, who had previously worked for a consulting firm specializing in healthcare fraud prevention. Walsh's appointment was part of a broader reorganization designed to improve the hospital's financial performance and prepare for an upcoming accreditation review. Walsh brought 20 years of experience in healthcare financial management, including expertise in detecting and preventing embezzlement schemes. Her previous employer had specialized in helping hospitals identify vulnerabilities in their financial systems, and she had personally investigated dozens of cases involving theft by employees ranging from janitors to senior administrators. Walsh's first initiative was a comprehensive audit of the hospital's accounts receivable, a process that involved reconciling insurance payments with outstanding patient balances, going back 18 months. Within 2 weeks, she had identified patterns that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Dozens of insurance reimbursement checks had disappeared over the past 8 months, always from different departments, never triggering individual alarm but collectively representing millions in missing revenue. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Checks from major insurance providers, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, United Healthcare, were disappearing at rates significantly higher than historical averages. The missing checks weren't from any single department or time period, but when mapped across the entire hospital, they revealed a systematic pattern of theft that had been invisible to the previous financial management team. On April 12, 2018, Walsh presented her findings to the hospital's board of directors in a conference room overlooking downtown Spokane. Her report, 23 pages of detailed financial analysis, demonstrated that Riverside Regional had lost approximately $2.8 million in insurance reimbursements over the previous 8 months. She recommended involving law enforcement immediately and implementing emergency financial controls to prevent further theft. Detective Ray Morrison of the Spokane Police Department's White-Collar Crime Unit received the case on April 15th, a gray Monday morning that began with reports of 3 separate burglaries and a domestic violence incident. Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for methodical investigation and an uncanny ability to understand criminal psychology, initially viewed the hospital theft as routine corporate embezzlement, probably an accounting employee with gambling debts or drug problems. Morrison had investigated dozens of similar cases during his career. Hospitals with their complex financial systems and large volumes of cash flow were attractive targets for employee theft. Most cases involved trusted employees who gradually escalated their stealing until they became careless or greedy enough to get caught. The amounts typically ranged from $10,000 to $100,000, significant enough to warrant prosecution, but not large enough to generate widespread attention. The Riverside Regional case was different from the beginning. The amount, nearly $3 million, suggested either a highly sophisticated scheme or multiple perpetrators working together. The duration, 8 months of sustained theft without detection, indicated someone with detailed knowledge of the hospital's financial systems and security procedures. The method, stealing insurance reimbursement checks rather than manipulating payroll or accounts payable, suggested someone with access to areas typically restricted to senior financial staff. Morrison began his investigation by requesting surveillance footage from the hospital's security system, a digital network that covered most public areas and administrative offices. What he found was remarkable. The same woman appeared in dozens of clips, always during evening hours, always in areas where money had gone missing. Sometimes she was emptying trash cans in accounting offices. Sometimes she was mopping floors in billing departments. Sometimes she was cleaning windows in administrative areas where insurance checks were processed. Always, she seemed to be exactly where she was supposed to be. The woman moved through restricted areas with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone whose presence was so routine that security guards and administrative staff didn't question her access. She knew which doors were unlocked, which offices were empty, which filing cabinets contained the most valuable targets. Her movements were purposeful but unhurried, suggesting someone who had carefully studied the hospital's routines and security patterns. Morrison ran the woman's image through the hospital's employee database and got a match within hours. Sarah Chen, custodial staff, 11 years of employment, no disciplinary actions, no history of financial problems. Her personnel file was remarkably unremarkable. Annual performance reviews that consistently rated her as satisfactory, attendance records that showed she rarely used sick leave, background checks that revealed no criminal history or concerning financial issues. On April 18th, Morrison visited the banks where the stolen checks had been deposited, carrying photographs of Sarah Chen alongside copies of the fake identification documents she had used. Bank managers in Coeur d'Alene, Pullman, and Missoula confirmed what Morrison already suspected. The same woman had been using multiple identities to deposit fraudulent checks for months, always professional in her demeanor, always prepared with supporting documentation, never raising suspicions that might trigger additional scrutiny. The bank security footage provided a timeline of Sarah's activities that amazed Morrison with its scope and sophistication. She had opened accounts across 3 states, established credit histories for her fictional identities, and maintained relationships with bank employees who remembered her as a pleasant, reliable customer. The fake identities weren't crude forgeries. They were carefully constructed personas with supporting documentation that included utility bills, employment records, and credit reports. Morrison realized he was dealing with someone far more intelligent and resourceful than the typical embezzlement suspect. Sarah Chen hadn't stumbled into crime through desperation or opportunity. She had methodically constructed a criminal enterprise that demonstrated planning, intelligence, and psychological sophistication that impressed even experienced investigators. Sarah sensed the investigation closing in before anyone said a word to her directly. Hospital administrators who had never noticed her before suddenly seemed to watch her every movement, their eyes following her as she pushed her cleaning cart through corridors where she had worked unobserved for 11 years. Security guards appeared in hallways where she worked, claiming to be conducting routine checks but clearly stationed to monitor her activities. The friendly billing manager who usually chatted with her about weekend plans became cold and professional, offering only brief nods when Sarah cleaned her office. The accounting staff, typically scattered throughout their department during evening hours, began working in groups, never leaving a single person alone in areas where sensitive documents were stored. Sarah's paranoia grew with each passing day. She began taking different routes through the hospital, varying her cleaning schedule, avoiding areas where she had previously committed thefts. She purchased a police scanner and monitored radio traffic for any mention of hospital-related investigations. She researched extradition laws and passport requirements, preparing for the possibility that she might need to flee the country. On the evening of April 23, 2018, Sarah made her decision. She would not be at work the next morning. She waited until David fell asleep, aided by the prescription painkillers he still took for cancer-related discomfort, then quietly packed 2 suitcases with clothes and essential documents. She had $40,000 in cash hidden in their basement, along with 3 fake passports she had purchased months earlier, as an escape plan she never thought she would need. The passports, professionally forged documents that cost $3,000 each, provided her with identities that could theoretically allow her to disappear completely. Sarah moved through their house like a ghost, gathering items she would need for a life on the run, while avoiding anything that might wake David or alert neighbors to her activities. She packed practical clothes, basic toiletries, copies of important documents, and jewelry that could be sold if necessary. She left behind photo albums, mementos from their marriage, and anything that connected her to the life she was abandoning. The letter she left for David was the hardest thing she had ever written. She explained everything: the theft, the fake identities, the money hidden in foreign accounts. She wrote that she had done it all to save his life, and now she was disappearing to save his reputation. She begged him not to look for her, not to follow her, not to sacrifice his chance at a normal life by remaining connected to her crimes. "I love you enough to let you hate me," she wrote in conclusion. "I love you enough to become the villain in our story so that you can be the survivor." At 3:17 a.m. on April 24th, Sarah Chen drove away from the only life she had ever known, leaving behind a husband who would wake to find himself married to a stranger, a criminal, a woman who had loved him enough to destroy everything they had built together. She made it exactly 47 miles before Washington State Patrol officers pulled her over on Interstate 90, just east of Spokane, near the small town of Liberty Lake. Detective Morrison had anticipated her flight and issued a BOLO alert for her vehicle hours earlier, after surveillance showed Sarah entering the hospital at 11:30 p.m. on April 23rd and leaving less than an hour later, unusual behavior for someone whose shift typically lasted until 6 a.m. The patrol officer who stopped Sarah, Trooper Michael Davis, had been expecting her based on Morrison's alert. Davis approached the traffic stop with the heightened awareness of someone dealing with a potentially dangerous suspect, but found instead a middle-aged woman sitting calmly in her Honda Civic, hands visible on the steering wheel, making no attempt to flee or resist. Sarah sat in her car on the side of the highway as rain began to fall, watching red and blue lights flash in her rearview mirror, and thinking about the chain of decisions that had brought her to this moment. She thought about David waking up alone in 3 hours, finding her letter, learning that his wife was a criminal whose love had transformed into the thing that would destroy his chance at a normal life. She thought about the hospital employees who would be questioned, suspected, investigated because of her actions. She thought about the patients whose insurance checks she had stolen, people who might have their own David somewhere, fighting their own battles against bankruptcy and disease. The officer approached her window with practiced caution, his hand resting near his weapon, but his demeanor professional rather than aggressive. Sarah rolled down her window and handed over her license before he could ask for it, a gesture that surprised Trooper Davis with its calm resignation. "Mrs. Chen, he said quietly, recognizing her face from the photos Detective Morrison had distributed. I need you to step out of the vehicle. Sarah nodded and complied without protest, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid any action that might be misinterpreted as threatening. As she stood beside her car in the pre-dawn darkness, with rain beginning to dampen her hair and clothes, she felt an unexpected emotion that had been absent from her life for months: relief. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists with a sound that seemed to echo across the empty highway. For the first time since October 17, 2017, the day she had stolen her first check, Sarah Chen was no longer running from consequences she had been dreading and anticipating with equal measure. The trial of Sarah Chen began on November 5, 2018, in Spokane County Superior Court, presided over by Judge Patricia Coleman, a 25-year veteran of the bench known for her thorough preparation and fair sentencing. The courtroom, usually half-empty for financial crimes that lacked the drama of violent offenses, was packed with hospital employees, local reporters, and community members fascinated by the story of an ordinary woman who had committed an extraordinary crime. Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez, a rising star in the district attorney's office with a reputation for thorough preparation and compelling courtroom presentations, painted a picture of calculated greed and sophisticated criminal planning. Martinez presented evidence of fake identities, offshore bank accounts, and systematic fraud that had cost the hospital nearly $3 million over 8 months. Her opening statement emphasized the premeditated nature of Sarah's crimes, the elaborate planning required to create multiple false identities, and the impact of the theft on the hospital's ability to provide patient care. This was not a crime of desperation, Martinez told the jury during her opening statement. This was a crime of opportunity, committed by someone who used her position of trust to systematically steal from an institution dedicated to healing the sick and saving lives. The defendant didn't steal to feed her family or pay rent. She stole to fund a lifestyle of luxury while her victims, the patients of Riverside Regional Medical Center, suffered the consequences of reduced resources and increased costs. Defense attorney Michael Rodriguez, a public defender with 15 years of experience representing clients who couldn't afford private counsel, argued that Sarah's actions, while inexcusable under the law, were motivated by desperation to save her husband's life rather than personal greed. Rodriguez presented evidence of the couple's financial devastation, David's medical bills totaling more than $200,000, and Sarah's spotless record prior to her husband's cancer diagnosis. Sarah Chen is not a criminal mastermind, Rodriguez told the jury. She is a wife who watched the man she loved dying of cancer while insurance companies and medical billing departments created bureaucratic obstacles that prevented him from receiving life-saving treatment. She made wrong choices, terrible choices, but she made them out of love, not greed. She made them because our healthcare system failed her family when they needed it most. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Martinez presented bank records showing Sarah's deposits across multiple states, surveillance footage showing her accessing restricted areas of the hospital, and testimony from bank employees who identified her as the woman who had used fake identities to cash stolen checks. The evidence created a timeline of criminal activity that spanned 8 months and demonstrated a level of planning and execution that impressed even veteran investigators. Detective Morrison testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through his investigation and explaining how Sarah's theft had been discovered. His testimony, delivered in the calm, professional tone of someone who had testified in dozens of similar cases, made Sarah's crime seem both sophisticated and ultimately foolish. The work of someone intelligent enough to evade detection for months, but not smart enough to stop before getting caught. David Chen testified on his wife's behalf, his voice breaking as he described learning about her crimes through the letter she left behind. Still thin from his cancer treatment, but healthy enough to work full-time, David presented a stark contrast to the desperate man Sarah had been trying to save. His testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the defense case, a husband's attempt to explain crimes he couldn't justify, but couldn't entirely condemn. She destroyed everything to save me, he said, tears streaming down his face as he spoke directly to the jury. I would rather have died than let this happen. I would rather have died than know that her love for me turned her into someone I don't recognize. Sarah Chen was the most honest person I ever knew, until cancer made her desperate enough to become someone else. The courtroom was silent as Sarah took the stand on November 19th, her first public statement since her arrest 7 months earlier. For 45 minutes, She detailed the progression from desperate wife to master criminal, never making excuses but explaining the logic that had driven each decision. Her testimony was remarkable for its honesty and self-awareness, acknowledging both the love that had motivated her crimes and the addiction to power and control that had sustained them. "I became invisible," she said near the end of her testimony, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow. "At the hospital, at banks, everywhere I went. People looked through me like I wasn't there, like I was part of the furniture or the cleaning equipment. For 8 months, I used that invisibility to take what I needed to save my husband's life. I told myself I was borrowing, that I would pay it back, that I was Robin Hood stealing from the rich to help the poor." She paused, looking directly at the jury with an expression that mixed regret with something harder to define. Perhaps pride, or perhaps simple recognition of her own capabilities. But really, I was just proving that I existed, that I mattered, that Sarah Chen, the invisible cleaning lady, was smart enough and strong enough to outsmart everyone who had never bothered to see her. I saved David's life, but I destroyed both of our lives in the process. I don't know if that makes me a hero or a villain. I just know that I loved my husband enough to become both. Judge Patricia Coleman sentenced Sarah to 12 years in federal prison on December 3, 2018, a sentence that fell within federal guidelines for financial crimes of this magnitude. Sarah was also ordered to pay $2.8 million in restitution, though prosecutors acknowledged that most of the money would never be recovered. The offshore accounts Sarah had established were frozen by federal authorities, but investigations revealed that only $400,000 remained in accessible accounts. The rest had been spent on David's medical treatment, hidden in cash deposits that were never recovered or transferred to accounts that investigators couldn't trace. "Mrs. Chen," Judge Coleman said before pronouncing sentence, "your crimes were motivated by love, but they were crimes nonetheless. You violated the trust of your employer, you stole from an institution dedicated to healing, and you created financial hardship for an organization that serves our entire community. Your love for your husband is admirable, but it does not excuse the magnitude of your criminal activity or the sophisticated planning that made it possible." Sarah stood silently as the sentence was pronounced, showing no emotion beyond a slight nod. That suggested she had expected this outcome. She was handcuffed and led from the courtroom while David Chen sat in the gallery, watching his wife disappear into the federal prison system that would house her for the next 12 years. Sarah Chen is currently serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Dublin in California, a minimum security facility that houses approximately 1,200 female inmates convicted of federal crimes. According to prison records, she has been a model prisoner, working in the facility's library and participating in educational programs designed to prepare inmates for re-entry into society. David Chen divorced her in March 2019, citing irreconcilable differences in court documents that made no reference to her criminal activities. He moved to Portland, Oregon, where he works as a mechanic at a Toyota dealership and has remained cancer-free for more than 6 years. David has never visited his ex-wife in prison, never responded to her letters, and declined to be interviewed for this story through his attorney. Riverside Regional Medical Center implemented comprehensive new financial controls following Sarah's arrest, including daily reconciliation of insurance payments, mandatory dual authorization for all check deposits, and enhanced background checks for employees with access to financial information. The hospital recovered approximately $200,000 from frozen bank accounts, but the remaining $2.6 million was never found, representing the largest unrecovered theft in the hospital's history. Sarah Chen is currently serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Dublin in California. David Chen divorced her in 2019 and moved to Portland, Oregon, where he works as a mechanic and has remained cancer-free. He has never visited his ex-wife in prison and declined to be interviewed for this story. Riverside Regional Medical Center implemented new financial controls following Sarah's arrest, including daily reconciliation of insurance payments and mandatory dual authorization for all check deposits. The hospital recovered approximately $200,000 from frozen bank accounts, but the remaining $2.6 million was never found. In her single interview with law enforcement, Sarah Chen claimed she had given most of the stolen money to cancer research charities and destroyed the records to protect the organizations from being implicated in her crimes. Investigators found no evidence to support this claim. Sarah Chen will be eligible for parole in 2027. She is 47 years old. For 8 months, an invisible hospital custodian outsmarted everyone around her, stealing nearly $3 million to save her husband's life. She succeeded in saving him, but destroyed everything else in the process. Whether love justifies crime remains a question that haunts everyone who knew Sarah Chen, the woman who became visible only after she disappeared.